New Testament reading, please. Luke 16.
The reading can be found on page 76 of the New Testament of the Church Bible, but I'm reading from the New International Version. The parable of the shrewd manager. Jesus told his disciples there was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called him in and asked him, "What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you cannot be manager any longer." The manager said to himself, "What shall I do now? My master is taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do, so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses." So he called in each one of his master's debtors. He asked the first, "How much do you owe my master?" 900 gallons of olive oil, he replied. The manager told him, "Take your bill, sit down quickly and make it 450. Then he asked the second, "How much do you owe?" 1,000 bushels of wheat, he replied. He told him, "Take your bill and make it 800. The master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much, and whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. So if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And if you have not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money.
Thank you. This story of a clever crime is exactly the sort of stuff that would get a bold headline in today's tabloid newspapers. Cool and clever embezzlement might be the hook that would be the headline to get you to read the story. But as Jesus tells this parable, which has been described by one commentator as the most difficult parable in Luke's gospel, it is not simply one of a crime, but it's a story with a most magnificent sting in its tail. As I always try and do when I'm preparing a service, I read the text. Sometimes look at how others have interpreted it, and maybe even read a couple of other people's sermons just to see if we're all on the same lines. One person's comment was that this parable was nothing short of weird. The proof being that when it comes down to us over time, it has a couple of well-known titles. These first 13 verses of Luke 16 are known both as the parable of the dishonest steward and the parable of the shrewd manager. Can it be both? If the conflicting titles of the parables seem confusing, the parable itself almost appears to be a riddle. One of the most debated and indeed debatable passages in the New Testament. So what does it actually mean? What was Christ trying to teach us in this parable? And above all, is this lesson still relevant to us today? For those that aren't preachers, that's called exegesis. One of the bits that local preachers studying tend to dread the most. Anyway, whichever way you read it, it appears confusing. Luke has obviously decided that it's about attachment to wealth, and as such has put it in with a couple of other stories about the dangers of money. And then, if you were following in the Bible, stuck in a couple of other verses afterwards, which appear completely random. One of which, for some strange reason, throws in some views on divorce. I've preached here on divorce before, so I'm not going to go there again. These extra verses just seem to heighten the sense that this is somewhat of a ragbag chapter. You can just picture Luke sitting at a desk with a bundle of papers in front of him. He's got the overall structure of the book sorted out, and he knows where all the main stories fit in. He's got the timeline sorted out, but then he looks across and is left with this small pile of papers marked miscellaneous. What on earth am I going to do with these, he thinks to himself. The old chap who told me this story said he was there when Jesus told it. But I can't help thinking that he must have missed something or wandered off before he finished. Jesus couldn't have told it that way, surely. Doesn't make sense. And that to me is how the story feels sometimes. It reads like something wrongly remembered, or someone missed the punchline. And perhaps even the original audience struggled to understand what Jesus was on about. Several of Jesus's parables were clearly amusing in their original context, but over the years have been retold by pious priests and scholars who believe that religion and laughter have nothing to do with each other. But if you read the story as being deliberately ironic and somewhat unsettling, then it does start to make a bit of sense. So let's have another look at the story. So a wealthy landowner calls in his business manager to give him the heads up that there's been rumors going around that the business manager was being careless with his estate, wasteful, and possibly even cheating. The business manager thinks to himself, oh, crikey, I could get fired here. That stinks. I can't afford to lose my job, and I'm not in the mood for manual labor, and begging on the street, well, that'd hurt my street cred. So I need to come up with a plan B. At least then I'll have somewhere to live. So what does he do? He calls in his boss's biggest debtors and forgives the debtors a portion of what they owe the landowner. And what that does, it makes them indebted to him, the business manager himself. But when the landowner finds out about how this scheming manager has reduced the bills of his debtors behind his back without telling him, the landowner is so mad that he yells at his dishonest manager. And he says to him, now that's actually some really shrewd thinking. And it just goes to show that the kids of today are much smarter than old fellas like me. And then, just to amplify the moral of the story, Jesus then says at the end, I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it's gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. The end. What? Did we really hear Jesus just say something about how dishonest or worldly wealth is great, and that honor among thieves is a virtue? Is that really what this parable means? Surely not. Many of Jesus's parables have something in the story that's either shocking or unexpected. In the parable of the Good Samaritan, it's shocking that a despised Samaritan would be the one to show love to his neighbor. In the story of the prodigal son, it's unexpected that the father would lovingly welcome home a rebellious and foolish son. And that parable also has a conclusion that appears both unexpected and, to the people of the time, certainly somewhat bewildering. In verse 8 of the reading, Jesus says that when the master found out what the dishonest manager had done, he commended the dishonest manager because he'd acted shrewdly. The thing that confuses many people is that he would actually praise a crook. But if you look carefully at the story, listen to the words, it's not the manager's dishonesty that is being commended, rather his shrewdness. In other words, his prudency and wisdom in planning for the future. After telling the parable, Jesus then exhorts his disciples, who he calls people of the light, to be just as shrewd or wise in using money for eternal benefits for the people of the world. Because he thinks the people of the world are using money for temporal benefits for themselves. And this, I believe, is the main point of the parable. Christians should use the money they have now wisely and use that money in a way that will honor God, but also in a way that will benefit themselves. So, the $64,000 question, how should we as Christians use our money wisely? Jesus answers that in verses 9 to 15 of the reading. First, to use money wisely, we need to recognize that we are simply the managers of the money and not really the owners. This mindset or attitude should change our behavior of how we handle our money. And it will result in a more careful and appropriate use of the money that we have received from God. We tend to be wiser and more cautious in using things that don't belong to us. If you borrow somebody else's car, I hope you tend to drive it more carefully and work harder to keep it clean because it doesn't belong to us. And you realize that ultimately we'll be accountable for how we've used it, how we've driven it. It's the same with the money. When we recognize that money doesn't belong to us, and that at the end of the day, we will be held accountable for its use, hopefully we'll be less inclined to use it selfishly or carelessly. So, we need to ask ourselves, after our family's needs are met, what do we usually do with the extra, if there is any? Is it primarily used for satisfying our own wants? Or is it used for furthering God's purposes? What would God want me to use my extra resources for? And I think our reading from Amos reflects some of that. Amos preached a message of judgment upon Israel. The message of judgment was because of how Israel treated the poor and the wretched of the land. Amos was a shepherd and a farmer, just like the Amos from Emmerdale when it used to be about farming. I always used to think of Amos Brayley when I looked at the book of Amos in the Old Testament. The problem that Amos saw with the people in Israel was that these people said that they worshipped the Lord and obeyed the Lord's commands. But the way they lived their lives clearly demonstrated that they didn't. The day of judgment had come, and the northern kingdom was utterly destroyed by Assyria, and the people of the northern tribes were taken away and ultimately lost to history. So what was it that these people did to provoke utter devastation and permanent destruction? The merchants defrauded and cheated. The poor, they were trampled upon, and the wretched were sold into slavery. The righteous ones for silver, and the poor simply for the cost of a pair of sandals. There's nothing wrong with being comfortable. Nothing wrong with having money. But there is something very wrong when the rich take money from the poor. When there is a great transfer of income from those who have little to those who have much. The Bible tells us that those who have been given much, of them, much is expected. Those who have are expected to share it with those who do not. So that leads us nicely into the second way that we as Christians should be using our resources. In verse 9, we heard that Jesus is telling us to use money to help people in a similar way as the manager did in the parable. This is what is meant by using worldly wealth to gain friends. Now that might seem a bit odd at first. I prefer the way the New Living Translation of the Bible puts it. Use your worldly resources to benefit others. In this way, your generosity stores up a reward in heaven. That to me makes it much clearer. Now it might be argued that the manager in the story we heard, did not use his own money, but he used the master's money to help others. But actually that takes us back to my first point. We're all ultimately using the master's money. We have none of our own. All we have ultimately comes from God. Keep in mind, the master commended the owner for being shrewd or wise enough to do this. So why is it wise to use money to help others? Simple answer. Money is temporary, but the reward for helping others is eternal. Jesus makes that point in verse 9 when he says this about money. When it's gone, you'll be welcomed into eternal blessings. So finally, to use money wisely, we must choose serving God as our highest priority. And at this point in the story, Jesus is speaking primarily to the religious leaders, the Pharisees. They were very much interested in accumulating money and possessions. They even taught that a person's wealth was connected to one's holiness or spirituality. In effect, they were the first prosperity teachers. They felt that their desire for money didn't conflict with them being a godly people. But as Jesus pointed out to them, you cannot serve both. You cannot be focused on obeying God and at the same time be solely focused on getting rich. You end up devoted to one whilst despising the other. Having money and God both as high priorities is like a man trying to have a mistress and a wife. It just doesn't work. And I don't speak from experience there. But I'm told the two are constantly in conflict with each other. You must choose one or the other. You must make a choice. Money or God. A mother gave her son £2 coins. One was for his Sunday school offering. The other was for sweets on the way home from church. As he walked along, the young lad was flipping one coin in the air and catching it on the way down. This happened a number of times when all of a sudden he missed catching it. It fell on the floor and rolled down a drain and was gone. The boy looked skyward and prayed, "Sorry, God." At some point in your life, you will have to make a choice between obeying and serving God with your money or spending it on your wants. If you love only money, you will in essence be doing what that little boy did and saying, "Sorry, God." In verse 14, the people who love money got upset at Jesus' message. They sought to justify or excuse their attitude towards money. But Jesus reminds them, God ultimately knows all of our hearts. He knows my heart, he knows your heart. Not only does God know how you handle money, but he also knows ultimately your true motivations. Make sure that in your heart you value and see money in the same respect as God does, which means you see money as a tool to help others and to honor God. But isn't this dishonest steward a guy who is seemingly making money his God? At first reading, maybe, but maybe not. He might be wasting his boss's resources. He might have been taking a little for himself. He might be complicit in the cooking of the books. But in other ways, he was what we might call today a whistleblower. Just think about that. He was the guy who was blowing the lid off the schemes of his boss. Now, I'm sure he only became a truth teller to save his own skin. But that actually just makes the parable more entertaining. Maybe that's all the parable of the dishonestly shrewd manager really is. An entertaining story with a surprising ending and a great moral. Jesus finishes by saying that he indeed realizes exactly what people value the most. He makes it clear that keeping our money for selfish indulgences is ultimately detestable in God's sight. I hope you will value what God values. God values faithfulness, helping others, generosity, and sacrifice. Amen. One of the resources that I like to use is a series of books by a guy called Nick Fawcett. Some of you may have used them. There is a meditation for every year, or every Sunday, should I say, over the 3-year cycle of the lectionary. And I thought I would read you the meditation that was written for today. And sometimes it's a meditation from a person who was there at the time, who maybe witnessed something that happened in the reading. This is a meditation of a modern day Christian in response to hearing that reading. What does he mean? Dishonest wealth? Oh, he's barking up the wrong tree there. For my money has been fairly earned. It's all legal and above board. Only, I suppose it's not that simple, is it really? For who can say what deals it's financed? How many palms it's greased? How many services it's bought? Or how many wrongs my money has contributed to? Yeah, it may seem innocent enough, the cash in my pocket, but it's a dangerous thing to be handled with caution. Not necessarily the root of all evil itself, but could be if we love it too much. And as I thought about those words of Jesus, really thought about them, I found myself increasingly uncomfortable, trying to water down, explain away what I'd rather not hear. I talk of using my money wisely. I talk of giving it to those in need. But more often than not, my charity starts at home and stays there. Yes, I talk of fair trade. I talk about ethical investment. Yet frequently it's all talk and nothing else. Time and time again, as Jesus warned, I attempted to serve two masters. And no prizes for guessing when the two clash, which one wins. Yes, I may get my money fairly, but do I use it fairly as well? That's the ultimate question. The first is easy enough. The second, not so easy. Let us pray. Forgive us, Lord, for we are part of an unjust and unequal world. A world in which we have plenty, often at the cost of others. Help us to do what we can to redress the balance, not just through giving to charity, but through using our money wisely so that it contributes towards change. Though economic issues are complex, please, Lord, save us from hiding behind them, from foolishly believing that we can have both our cake and eat it, serving self as well as you. Amen.